Good morning, everybody joining us here in our Zoom room. We're just a couple of minutes before we start, so we're going to give it just a bit while folks are joining. Thank you all for being with us this morning. We really appreciate your time here at our 5th annual, first virtual, March 4th. Good morning, Melissa. Thanks for joining us. Yes, Melissa has already discovered the chat feature is available to you all this morning. So if you want to chime in from with where you're from, that's also going to be your opportunity to ask questions of our panelists as we get underway. And we are right now at 10 o'clock. So I'm going to turn it over to Holland.
Good morning, everyone. I am Holland Perryman, and I'm a student intern with the Pat Conroy Literary Center. Welcome to the nonprofit Pat Conroy Literary Center's 5th annual and first virtual March 4th event, now a 3-day event. March 4th commemorates the anniversary of Pat Conroy's death with a series of educational and inspirational conversations about some of the major themes of Mr. Conroy's life: storytelling, conservation, social justice, and inclusivity. Our March 4th programs are presented in partnership with Penn Center, Nevermore Books, the Beaufort County School District, and First Presbyterian Church of Beaufort. This year's March 4th is sponsored by South Carolina Humanities, a non-for-profit organization inspiring, engaging, and enriching South Carolinians with programs on literature, history, culture, and heritage. We're grateful to all of our partners, sponsors, presenters, attendees, and volunteers for making possible this signature annual program of the nonprofit Pat Conroy Center. This morning, we welcome former state newspaper journalist Claudia Smith Brinson for a discussion of her new book, Stories of Struggle: The Clash Over Civil Rights in South Carolina. Ms. Brinson will be joined in conversation with Reverend Joseph A. Darby. A South Carolina journalist for more than 30 years, Claudia Smith Brinson has won more than 30 awards, including Knight Ritter's Award of Excellence and O. Henry Award for Short Fiction. She is also a member of the Pulitzer finalist team, which covered Hurricane Hugo. Stories of Struggle: The Clash Over Civil Rights in South Carolina is her first book and newly published by USC Press. A native of Columbia, Reverend Joseph A. Darby is a fourth-generation minister in an African Methodist Episcopal Church. Reverend Darby has served 4 congregations in the Midlands of South Carolina and Morris Brown AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. He also served on the general board of the AME Church and as the presiding elder of Beaufort District. He is now the pastor of Nichols Chapel AME Church in Charleston. Please welcome our March 4th presenters, Claudia Smith Brinson and Reverend Joseph A. Darby.
Good morning to you all, and thank you for starting your Saturday morning with us. Reverend Darby and I are going to have a conversation, but first we're going to connect then and now through some slides that I've, well, that's an old-fashioned word, isn't it? Photographs that I've collected from archives that illustrate people and moments in the book. And so we're going to start off with a shared screen while I walk you through the late 40s into the late 50s. And then Reverend Darby and I are going to talk about how so many of the things that were happening then are familiar to us now. For example, the resurgence of terrorism with the KKK and other groups, voter suppression, unions. Amazon is being challenged in terms of a union again. So there are many moments of tension that are in Stories of Struggle that are being replicated now because we have so much unfinished business. The book itself focuses on the activists. It's not an event-oriented book, it's a people-oriented book. And you'll be able to see that some from the photographs that I'm going to show you, which are from South Caroliniana Library in Columbia, South Carolina, Richland Library in Columbia, and also from Cecil J. Williams, who is a civil rights photographer. So this first picture, a man was lynched yesterday, you might be familiar with. It's from the Library of Congress. And the Lynch Flag was set up in 1920 at the NAACP headquarters and was used until 1938 when they were threatened with losing their lease and being kicked out of the city if they didn't stop using it. It was initiated because of a specific lynching in Georgia, and it continued being hanged every day because there was pretty much a lynching every day. And South Carolina is one of the 12 states that had the most lynchings in the United States. The upstate was more aggressive with this than other parts of the state. The Equal Justice Institute has great documentation of this that they're enhancing every day. And they count so far 6,500 lynchings over the time period that they're looking at, which is from the late 1800s after Reconstruction through 1950. And so a lynching does not mean that you have been hanged from a tree. A lynching is an extrajudicial murder in a place where there is a judiciary. And people who were lynched in South Carolina were often tortured in an immense variety of ways before they were hanged from a tree. They would be dragged through a city by horse or by people. They would be beaten. They would be riddled with bullets. And finally, the last act might be to lynch them. The EJI also makes a point that they were what they call public spectacle lynchings. So the whole town would gather, someone would be pulled out of jail, children would be there would be picnics, there would be people taking souvenirs from the body afterwards. This is Reverend James Miles Hinton, and from 1941 to 1958, he was the NAACP State Conference president. He was, as you can see from those strong eyes, a fierce and brave man who publicly proclaimed that he would rather die than live on his knees. And what he was focused on was what he called first-class citizenship. First-class citizenship for him was the vote. And so he sponsored several voting rights acts. I'm going to talk about them in a minute. And he also was active with trying to desegregate higher education. It's because of him that South Carolina State briefly had a state law school for African Americans. And he also was pivotal to the fact that Brown versus Board of Education, which declared segregation unconstitutional, existed because it began in Summerton, South Carolina, through his challenge to ministers throughout the state to gather their people together and ask for a school bus. At this point in time, in the late 40s, there were no school buses, there were no water fountains in black schools, there were privies outside rather than bathrooms inside, there were no playgrounds. Why? Because taxes went almost only to the white schools. It was a 10-to-1 funding variation. I want to also mention that when Reverend Darby said he was content to die rather than live on his knees, he meant that. His house was blasted with buckshot. He was abducted by the KKK. He moved between Augusta and Columbia because he was with a life insurance company in Augusta. He was kidnapped in Augusta, taken out into the woods, tied to a tree and beaten with chains with the intent to bring him to near death or death. This brutal act was abbreviated because the abductors had their car radios on and heard that they were being hunted. What had happened when he was abducted, he had been told the doorbell was rung at his boarding house. When he came out in his pajamas, he was told someone had hit his car. He went with the white man down toward the cars. 3 of them grabbed him, thrust him into the car, took him out into the woods. They left their headlights and their car radios on. The landlady and a white neighbor both reported the kidnapping. And as Reverend Hinton said afterwards, there was a whole posse of preachers out looking for him, and it was good for their immortal souls that they didn't find the abductors. He was able to identify them. One of their guns was found. However, as was usual in South Carolina, nothing was done to arrest these people. This is one of the things that happened regularly to World War II veterans. So this is Isaac Woodard, and he was a veteran who was coming from Augusta through Batesburg, Leesville to go home after being released from the military. He wanted the bus to stop at one of the stations so that he could go to the restroom. The bus driver got very aggressive with him. Bus drivers in South Carolina had police powers and were extraordinarily rude and brutal to their passengers. At this point in segregation, if you were a Black person on a bus, you had to sit beyond a certain point. If more white people got on, you had to keep backing up until perhaps you even had to leave the bus. When the bus driver refused to stop, Isaac Woodward said, "I am a man just like you are a man." And that angered the bus driver so much that he stopped in Batesburg, Leesville, told the police. The police beat Isaac Woodward and used their billy club to gouge out his eyes. Other veterans who were on the bus got in touch with Reverend Hinton, but they had a hard time locating Isaac Woodward, who was in a VA hospital and then taken off elsewhere by relatives. And once he was located, Reverend Hinton and John McCrae, who was a Black newspaperman, got testimony on what had happened, got in touch with Truman, got in touch with President Truman's civil rights group, this commission that he was the first president to set up. And then it became a national cause. There was a fundraiser that Woody Guthrie sang at, Billie Holiday sang at, the boxer champion Joe Louis was part of it. And they all raised funds for his medical care. And as was wont in South Carolina, there were a few people arrested because of the national pressure, but it took 28 minutes for the all-white jury to acquit the police person who had wounded Isaac Woodward. And this was a chronic problem. If people were ever arrested, it was usually because of national pressure, but because of suppression of voters. There were almost no African Americans that were eligible to be, because you have to be in voter registration rolls to be on a jury. Women were not allowed on juries at this point, white or Black. And so the white men would acquit their colleagues, so to speak. This is George Elmore, and George Elmore and Reverend Hinton managed to challenge South Carolina's all-white primary. So Reverend Hinton would get a group of people and they would stand out stores and other locations where registration books were, and they would wait for the clerk to pull the registration book up. When the book was pulled up, they would rush over to try to register to vote. They've been doing this for 2 years. This was 1946, and they had not been successful. George Elmore was a photographer. He was a taxi driver. He owned the store he's standing in front of, and he was a successful businessman who was also a rather chatty, garrulous type, and to some, he did not look like an African American, although he identified as a Black man. And so he joined this group, asked them what was going on. They were on Millwood, which is right across from a large neighborhood, and they were waiting, as I explained. And Elmore said, "Well, let me go over there and see what I can do." So he walked in, ordered a Coca-Cola, and the clerk in there thought he was white and started complaining about the men across the street and said, "Have you registered to vote?" And Mr. Elmore said, "No." And she said, "Well, it's very important for white people to register to vote." She pulled out her book. She got him to sign his name. And then when they flipped to the page where he was to put his address, which was in the Waverly neighborhood, which is an all-Black neighborhood, and he signed his address, she said, "Well, you're and you can assert this word." And she got very angry, but he had already signed into the book. And she said, "Fine, go get your friends and bring them over." And that way, 6 men were registered to vote in Columbia. And so then George Elmore sued when he was prohibited from voting after being registered. And he sued with 60 others, and they won. Their lawsuit went into the same court that Isaac Woodward's lawsuit went into, J. Wade's Waring. Waring had been getting a change of heart over the horror of having a veteran maimed and then his assailant acquitted. And so he was a little more open to these lawsuits than perhaps other white judges were. And so he said it was time for South Carolina to join the Union. South Carolina was the very last state to have a white primary. He ordered the primary open, South Carolina being South Carolina. And I hope that by the time I go through with this slideshow, you're going to believe that South Carolina is not at all the moderate state it claims itself to be. It then created a segregation oath. And so, yeah, you could register to vote, but you had to promise that you believed in and supported in and behaved in a manner that accommodated segregation. So they sued again with a gas station worker in Beaufort named Brown versus Baskin, and they won again. And so this is Reverend Hinton right here and with the open collar shirt voting in 1948. Now, keep in mind that as I go along and talk about these things, years are passing while these cases are being pursued, or these causes. So Reverend Hinton was interviewed for voting at this moment. He said he was happy as a lark. This is the voting lines, and this would be familiar to you from the most recent voter suppression efforts in places like Georgia. These people are all in line in the 4th Ward, which was an African-American ward in Columbia. At 6, most of them are still in line, so they're not going to get to vote. And why aren't they going to get to vote? Because even though they've registered, there aren't enough polling places, and they close the polling places before there's success in voting. This is Reverend Archie Ward. He too wanted to vote after voting, after being able to register. And he was attacked at Calhoun Falls with what were called hawkbill knives, which are knives that were used in slaughter. And he was attacked in front of police officers after he left his voting booth. And he was left for dead. He survived. There are pictures in South Carolina of his body being treated. And you can see how long and horrible the cuts are. These are the clothes he was wearing when he was cut up. And the newsman, John McCrae, took that picture. Reverend Ware left. He felt it wasn't safe to stay in South Carolina. He had identified his assailants. However, the police officer in Calhoun Falls said, oh, it might take 3 weeks, 3 months, 3 years, who knows, to find the assailants, who, as I said, were identified. This is a photo by my friend Cecil J. Williams, and he calls it the children of segregation. These are all children who are identified as Black in South Carolina. This is Cecil's neighborhood in Orangeburg. Here's Cecil, and here's his best friend, Leon Sultan. And so I have this picture here to remind you of how widespread the laws and customs of segregation were, and how strong an effort it was to eliminate the lives of anyone who might be in any way related to an African American. This is another picture of another moment in South Carolina that went national. This is Willie Earl. Willie Earl was a young man of 24. He had epilepsy. He'd been a truck driver, but at this point in his life, before this event, of course, he was not able to work because of his epilepsy, and the fact that all his neighbors knew this. And a taxi driver, this is in Greenville, was stabbed. He did not identify his assailant by name or description, other than saying it was an African-American man. For some undisclosed, unknown reason, Willie Earl was then arrested. He was not charged, but he was put in jail. A mob of taxi drivers decided that they were going to punish this so-called assailant. The jailer let them in. They took Willie Earl into the Greenville area near a slaughterhouse and murdered him. This is where his body has been reconstructed. He was cut in many different places and left in a ditch. They called a Black mortician. The Black mortician called Reverend Hinton. Reverend Hinton went to the mortician with permission from Willie Earl's mother, Tessie Earl, took these photographs, which then went national. Once again, the national government was involved, and so the FBI came in. Strom Thurmond was governor at the time. He grudgingly acknowledged that he didn't like mob rule. 31 people were arrested very quickly over a few days, thanks to the FBI. 26 of them confessed. However, in court, the judge said they could only implicate themselves, not the persons that they implicated as the assailants with the knives and guns that murdered Willie Earl. And so once again, there was a trial because of national pressure, but everyone was acquitted in a very short order. This article is in the New Yorker. It's by Dame Rebecca West. She had just been covering the Nuremberg trials in which Nazis were being convicted. And the New Yorker thought there was a comparable situation here and sent her to Greenville. Her article is called Opera in Greenville because she thought it was operatic. And she said that she was told by many of the white people in Greenville that lynching was a social prophylactic. In other words, it was needed to oppress the African Americans, or as a white person might say, to keep them in their place. This is a school at the time. I mentioned schools earlier. So this is a school that was used into 1950. This is Maddie Delane, and her colleague Helen Richburg. Their husbands were very active in acting initially for a school bus and then for what they called Equal Everything, which I'll explain in a minute, and then desegregation of schools in Somerton, South Carolina. This is a typical school. No white person is going to assist the Black people in maintaining their schools. The Black people were often using charity schools that were built by Rosenwald, who was part of the Sears and Roebuck heirs. There were also schools, as this one is, that were behind churches because the church was allowing for an extra building to be used, Mason lodges and abandoned hunting lodges. And so you might have 70, 80 children in one room in one building. And as I said before, with none of the things that we take for granted nowadays that were at that time in white schools, like indoor toilets or heating. Even water. Kids would bring the water from wells nearby. They would bring coal and collect wood for heat that they would burn in an oil drum. Their books were the discards from white schools. And so with Reverend Hinton, Reverend Delane, Reverend Richburg, and Reverend Seals' guidance, and they were the educated people that could guide everybody. They asked for first a school bus, and then for what they called Equal Everything, which was to get better schools and appropriate school supplies. And then finally, through the NAACP support, desegregation. So it was the first of 5 lawsuits to comprise Brown versus the Board of Education. And so these are the people that truly changed America. This is Reverend Seals. He was raising his grandson in town. His wife and grandson had to leave for New York because the KKK would surround the house regularly and shoot into it. This is Reverend Delane. His house was burned down. There was a murder attempt against him, which I'll tell you quickly about in a second. And this is Reverend Richburg, who had the church that you see behind you. His parishioners patrolled it day and night with guns to protect him. Reverend Delane was warned that he was going to be assassinated because of his active role in guiding everyone in this lawsuit. And so the person who warned him was a white woman whose husband was among the plotters, and she was so horrified. She tracked him down, told him what was going to happen. So he was forewarned, went into town, knew who his assailant would be. His assailant was came up to him to say, "You or me is going to hell today." And Reverend Delane pretended with his hand and a pocket knife that he had a gun in his pocket and said, "I'm not going to hell." At that moment, a truck pulled up, an Esso truck with a friend of his driving it, Joe Brown, who had just been fired from his job because of being a petitioner. And while white people watched, he jumped into the truck and was rescued. There was a group of white people deliberately watching because if Reverend Delane survived the attempt, they were going to say he was the assailant, so he'd go to jail. And if he didn't survive the attempt, they were going to say he's the assailant, so that a true assailant would not be prosecuted. So there were 104 petitioners in the first lawsuit, and then fewer than 40 deliberately because of the pressure that was put on people in the second, which was the desegregation lawsuit that went to the Supreme Court. This is Mrs. Briggs, Harry Briggs. So it's Briggs versus Elliott. This is her husband, and this is one of her children. And this is what was left of Reverend Delane's house as a threat to him. His church was also burned, and the KKK were shooting into his house one night. He had told the sheriff that he would finally start shooting back to mark the cars that were circling his home so that someone would be arrested. He did mark a car, but then he and his wife decided they needed to get out of town. She went to hide at a neighbor's. He went on a 100-mile chase through Florence County toward Columbia and relatives, managed to escape, and New York City refused to extradite him, and he became a national celebrity. But of course, he had lost his ability to come back to South Carolina because they never dropped the warrant against him. And we'll end with these last 2 lawsuits, so I don't take up too much time. I want to hear from Reverend Darby. This is the KKK, of course, and this is 1957, and they're on the State House steps. African Americans were arrested if they set foot on the State House grounds or the University of South Carolina grounds, but the KKK could have rallies. They had just formed what they called a human cross after marching up and down Main Street. And this was 3 weeks after the KKK had bombed in Gaffney the home of Claudia Sanders, who had written in a brochure that urged moderation in race relations. The KKK had actually tried to dynamite her house 3 times. It was the 3rd attempt that was somewhat successful. It blew up the chimney in the front of her house, but no one was injured. Under pressure, 5 people were arrested. 2 were then not charged. 1 mysteriously died when a car fell on him, and 2 were acquitted. And so this is 2 weeks afterwards, and the Grand Wizard says he knows nothing about it when he's interviewed by the paper. And I want to remind you that all kinds of white people were a member of these terrorism groups. So there was a women's auxiliary, there were children's auxiliary. Many of the cross burnings in this period of time would be attended by 1,000 or more people. And of course, there were more so-called intimate cross burnings, where you would wake up in the middle of the night with a cross burning on your lawn. If you were a white person, express moderation, but most especially if you were a Black person that was asking for the rights that you believe the Constitution had provided you. And I'd like to make the point here that most of the people I interviewed know the Constitution. And I'm talking to people who were active in this in the 40s and 50s, and many of them have passed on since I started working on the book. But their deep belief in constitutional rights and their backup of their church and their neighbors is what powered them through these terrible years when they are personally being attacked for asking for their rights. So this is the White Citizens Council, and that's a Confederate flag up there. They were formed to do economic pressure. They were called the KKK in suits and ties, as you can see. We have 50,000 in South Carolina within a year of it being formed in Mississippi. And this is the Mississippi Senator, Senator Eastland. This is Strom Thurmond, who I mentioned before, who served into, I think, 2000. This is Mendel Rivers, the Charleston senator. And this is Saul Blott, who was Speaker of the House until 1970. They're all up on the stage because they supported the White Citizens Councils and their efforts to repress Black activism and to keep, as many of these gentlemen said, white supremacy, that the nation was for whites and only whites. And I'm going to stop here with this flag, which is by Dred Scott, D-R-E-A-D Scott, who is an artist. And this flag was something that he designed after Walter Scott was murdered by a police officer in North Charleston. So that is me racing through just a few years and a few people that are in the book, Stories of Struggle. And Reverend Darby and I want to talk to you now about voter suppression and the rise of nationalism and attacks on minorities and all the other things that were happening then and are still happening now, which does not mean these people did not have a very strong influence on the United States. The Civil Rights Act occurred because of them, 1964 and 1965. Our behavior changed, white people's behavior changed because of them. Black people's behavior changed because they got rights that had been due to them for centuries. And so we became a somewhat better nation through their effort, but it's certainly not done, as Reverend Darby is going to remind us. So Reverend Darby, was that fast enough?
That was fast enough, Claudia. Yes, it was.
So I'm hoping that you will challenge us and remind us that what we're seeing here is just a smidgen of what South Carolina was like. For you to grow up as a Black person in the state.
Yeah, and it's what's the old saying, everything old is new again. The same things that were going on then really never stopped. The 50s, I was born in 1951, so I was a child during a lot of the time that you talked about, but was aware of the movement when I was a little older and things were still hot and I was in my teens. I was an only child and my mother said, no, you're not gonna go out and get killed. And I lamented the fact back then, especially after Civil Rights Acts were signed. I said, well, I missed the chance to get involved. And I didn't know that chance would be ongoing and I'm still involved. South Carolina likes to consider itself to be a very genteel place. And that's simply not the case. There are people who make apologies for a lot of the racists who supposedly saw the light later on, and that just didn't happen. I think the book, which is an excellent book, I recommend it highly, points that up. The thing that struck me in the book was that I knew people. The book did not just deal with, you did not just deal with the notable, you dealt with some of the little noticed. So I found out my high school principal was a good friend of Hinton's. I found out that one of my favorite bishops, John Adams, his father, was involved heavily in the struggle in Columbia. And it's remarkable to see that. And it's a reminder that we still have to be aware of what's going on. That there's a song that we sing in the African Methodist Episcopal Church called "My Soul Be on Thy Guard." And we still have to do that to a degree because, you know, it's thought that the Civil War is over. And yeah, it's not. There's been 150 some odd years ceasefire. The last 4 years reminded us how fragile race relations are and how fraught democracy can be when the wrong people end up in charge. So I take the book and I take the story of what happened in South Carolina as a cautionary tale. And I think that we ought to view it in light of that history that way.
Jump in here and say, several people have asked me, why didn't I know more about this? Well, part of it would be on you, that you didn't make the efforts, but there also was censorship. White-owned newspapers, for example, covered the first sentence and then stopped because they didn't want to have uprisings, so to speak. So you may not know how many sit-ins there were in your community because there was only a white-owned newspaper and they deliberately suppressed the information. There was one Black-owned newspaper until 1955, the Lighthouse and Informer. After that, John McCrae, who I'd mentioned, was writing for the Afro papers, which were in Baltimore, Washington, Philadelphia, et cetera, and the Philadelphia Courier and the Chicago Defender. But that would be sending someone down from those northern cities to report, or Mr. McCrae making an effort to get a job to write about something. Television. The reason we know about the horrors at Edmund Pettus Bridge is because the film was put on an airplane and flown to New York that day and interrupted some broadcasts, and people saw for the first time ever what was going on in that moment. Well, not in that moment, but on that day. So I'll tell you a quick story about why we don't have many pictures of the violence. For example, in Orangeburg, fire hoses and gas were used against students in the first sit-ins that they did into town. And Cecil Williams was trying to photograph this. He was arrested. He was picked up by both arms and his camera ripped off his neck. The camera was thrown into the trunk of a car. He was locked into the police car, so he could not document anymore. And Cecil had sort of a moderate hold on nonviolent direct action. So since he was left alone in the car, he took apart the police car radio. So that was his little revenge for his destroyed Roley and the ripped off film. But these things were happening. They just deliberately were not recorded in South Carolina. And there was a very powerful propaganda machine with people like Thurman and Hollings. Hollings was so upset about the Republican and Democratic civil rights platforms that he paid himself to go off during the convention platform design to California to try and stop the civil rights platform. He was furious about the sit-ins. The students were carrying Bibles, and he said the Bibles are in the hearts of our police. The students are pretending to read the Bible when they sit at the police counters. And at his eulogy, he was praised for saying that Harvey Gantt's admission into Clemson should be peaceful because South Carolina had run out of courts. South Carolina had run out of courts. We were the next to last by 3 months in desegregating any higher education facility. And that's on Hollings. So when he was making something sound good, it was not good. It was one of the other tactics that South Carolina used in more modern times, which is spending millions and millions and millions of dollars in court to deny constitutional rights.
Yeah, that's the case. That's the case, you know, and that's why I don't cut Strong Thurman any slack, because people talk about how he evolved. He didn't evolve. He did what was politically expedient when he started trying to figure out how to get Black votes when there was no way to stop Black folks from voting in there. So I cut Fritz Hollings very little slack because it wasn't that he was a visionary, he was a reactionary, actually. And when the only act that he could take was to give it up, because as you said, South Carolina had run out of courts, that was the end of that. And so a lot of people, it's shaped not only by scant media coverage, it's shaped by inerrant history. When I was in school, there was a lady named Mary Sims Oliphant. Her history book was a history that was taught. And well, it was the history that was supposed to be taught. As one of my teachers at Booker T. Washington High in Columbia said, this is your history book, and we're going to lay it aside and we're going to talk truth. Because according to her history, I was, my ancestors were happy Negroes and well treated and just bothered by the fact that someone would dare disturb them. And it's that kind of thing that shaped a lot of people's lives. And a lot of people still believe that and pass that down. So it gets to be how ungrateful are these Black folk? Don't they know what we have done for them? And it also kind of dehumanizes. It means that you have to be controlled. That's why the police and the policing in America, and especially in the American South, started out as slave patrols, picking up folks who had tried to flee slavery, and it maintained that idea of social control. That's why when you had the Capitol riot a few weeks ago, a month ago now, you had protesters saying, you're not supposed to be doing this to me, you're supposed to be doing this to Black Lives Matter protesters, because they felt that their skin color exempted them from some things.
Yeah, the Sims book was used into the 70s, and I have a copy, and she has a paragraph in there where she says, the noble white Klansmen we needed to suppress the savages. There's a whole paragraph where she's early on in the book praising KKK, and that was taught into the 70s. So it's not just that Black history is left out, but that a false history of white people is also told as noble people making a soothing environment. And it's a very dangerous way to grow up. Some people have asked, why did you write this book? And I have several answers, but among them is that I was lucky enough to have grown up on military bases in foreign countries. So I was often the unusual person in the group. And I lived in something like 16 places in 23 years. So I was often the outsider trying to figure out how the inside works. I lived in Japan, for example, for 4 years. And I was the military had been desegregated in 1949. So I never say I was in an integrated culture. I was not. It was still white dominant, but it was desegregated. So unlike other people my age, I did not grow up in segregated schools. And I think one of the things that happens when you move around a lot is you become sort of a amateur anthropologist. So you're always asking, why are these people doing this way? And so when I came into South Carolina, I very quickly started asking that question. And one of the things I noticed right away was the stories that older Black activists told me had no match whatsoever with the version of South Carolina that was sort of the official white version. And that was very disturbing to me. And I think it's dangerous for all of us when we grow up thinking that a facade is real. And I think that's a real problem with the fact that I hate this phrase, but historians talk about top down and bottom up history. So they would say I was doing bottom up, which I find so offensive, which was going out and finding the missing stories. But if you're not Martin Luther King on the cover of Life magazine, or you're not LBJ or John JFK, you're not all these famous people who are being recorded in real time, your story may be lost because you may be having 2 or 3 jobs. You aren't keeping a diary. You aren't being interviewed by anybody. And so your experiences they're just gone. And we need to do more about that. And that became my mission. I did not want these stories lost. And so I made the opportunity to collect people's stories whenever I could in the most respectful way possible.
That's a good thing. And it's one of the things I like about the book. As I said, I knew Mr. Richburg was my principal, but I didn't know he was quietly active in the movement and had to be quietly active because the NAACP was anathema in South Carolina right then. People tried to get it labeled a subversive, communist, socialist organization, rhetoric that we hear now again. And I'm amused at the present rhetoric, particularly when folk who tried to overthrow the government try to quote Martin King and talk about how wonderful Martin King was. And I say to myself, you know, if you were back there in the 50s, he would be a subversive communist. He was an agitator, and y'all would have wanted him dealt with as folks tried to deal with him back then. So, you know, it's always interesting to me that civil rights people become heroes after they're dead and can no longer do civil rights. And it's unfortunate, and it reminds me not only in Black History Month, but it reminds me on a regular basis that a lot of folks who sing Kumbaya and say we all one under the flesh don't understand that America still has miles to go to hit racial equity.
Yeah. Jonathan, do you have some questions for us?
We're getting a lot of really wonderful comments in the chat, which I am responding to as they're coming in. A lot of folks are asking how to be in touch with you, Claudia. Can they do that through their website if they want to host you for other events or other conversations?
I would be delighted. And I have an email linked to my website, storiesofstruggle.com. So if you go there, you can email me easily and I will answer immediately. So thank you for your interest. I really, really do want to tell the stories of the wonderful people I met. And I cherish the opportunity to do that. I feel like the book was, for me, it was a spiritual quest. I met some absolutely wonderful people. And as I said before, it just felt so wrong to me that their stories were not being told. And so I want to keep telling their stories because many of them have passed on. And I would include in my list of wonderful people, Reverend Darby, when I was on the editorial board, who's one of my favorite op-ed writers.
Fun times.
He's a truth teller, and he's lived much of this and knows what the experiences are like. And that was another part of this that I found just heartrending. Someone's asked me what were the things that surprised me. I can't say I was surprised by things that happened in South Carolina, but there were things that people told me about that happened to them that I found gut-wrenching, where my whole body would pull back from a story because it was so sad or so upsetting. And I do feel that we need to know how hard it is to make a whole nation change. On the other hand, I think we need to know it is possible. Most of the people I interviewed, I don't like these words either, but you could say they were ordinary people. They were school teachers, they were gas station attendants, like I already mentioned. They were small store owners, they were housekeepers, and yet they got up in the morning, as the song says, with freedom on their mind. They got up in the morning and they went out to carry a sign or paint a sign or to sign a petition, knowing that they would be making the world better for their children and for other generations, but perhaps not for themselves. And knowing that it was life-threatening, and they still did it. And so when I look at the sit-in movement, or I look at Briggs versus Elliott, or I look in the book later on at the Charleston hospital strike, there were always gains made. South Carolina could not stop these people. And so a movement does require persistence, and it probably requires numbers, but it doesn't require unusual people. It requires people just like us.
I think there's a need for people to get involved, and there's a need for books like yours, hopefully, to generate some introspection on people's part, even if they're convinced that they are unabashedly progressive, because every now and then, progressive folks can get a little lost too. When I was pastor of Morris Brown AME in Charleston, we had a dialogue going with another church, Circular Church, predominantly white, United Church of Christ, and UCC makes the AME Church look like the Southern Baptist Church. So they were exceedingly progressive. And one of the things we were planning was a social event and looking at dates. And they looked at one date and said, that date will not work. That won't work because that's the day of Mayor Joe Riley's back to school giveaway, supply giveaway. And so that might be a problem for some folk at Morris Brown. And one of my folks at Morris Brown was a student enough before I could say, why would a giveaway be a problem for families at Morris Brown and not families at Circular? And that's when the dialogue was still progressive, but it got very real. And I think we made some breakthroughs in that. So hope books like your book cause folks to do a little self-examination.
Yeah, I noticed that attitude about poverty when I first came to South Carolina. I started off as an education reporter, but I got permission to spend 5 years writing only about poverty. And the reason I asked for that permission was because of the racist attitude about poverty. So people were constantly saying, and I think most people will recognize this phrase, thank God for Mississippi, ha ha ha, right? Mississippi was 50, South Carolina was 49 or 48. So thank God for Mississippi. We're okay with being poor. And when I pawed into that, what I found was that people thought deep poverty was Black poverty. So if you're white, well, that was okay. And of course, statistically, because after the Great Migration, South Carolina was majority white, numerically, more white people are poor. It's just that in South Carolina, and this was in the very late 70s and early 80s, the deepest poverty in the Low Country, for example, were African Americans. And so there's this bizarre cavalier attitude about poverty. It's the same thing with education. Reverend Darby and I were talking before this event about the only constitution that guaranteed everybody a full education was the Reconstruction Constitution. So the constitutions before the Civil War did not give education. In fact, through the 16 to the 1800s, while New England and other states are guaranteeing public education, South Carolina is making it illegal to teach any Black person to read and write, and only has pauper schools and one school per county for any white person who wants to go to school. In World War I and World War II, South Carolina couldn't get draftees into the war because they couldn't pass the literacy test. So it's a constant denying of education. So after the Reconstruction, they were going to close the schools if you tried to go to a different school. Well, the post-Reconstruction Constitution set up segregated schools. And when Briggs versus Elliott was occurring, South Carolinians, white South Carolinians, keep in mind, because you can't register to vote, you're not going to vote. South Carolinians voted 2-1. They would rather close schools, this was a constitutional amendment, than desegregate schools. You know, what does that say about a belief in education or a belief in lifting all boats? And
it's our present constitution, the one that was done after Reconstruction under Ben Tillman. Very
same constitution.
That says that everyone should be guaranteed a minimally adequate education, and that says everything. And it's the assumption that privilege will get you over. One of the great examples of white privilege I experienced myself when I was in high school. It was a couple of years before the schools in Columbia actually integrated. Preparatory to that, they started doing these little stabs to see how that would go. And I was involved in one of those. They put together a summer program for data processing back in the punch card days of computing. And they took students from Booker T. Washington, my school, which was Black, and Olympia, which was not that far away, white school, folks of modest means for the most part, and put us in a summer program together. And there was one white kid who was obviously poor, obviously struggling, so much so that his peers kind of shunned him and seemed to do little to do with him. And, you know, those of us from Booker T, Martin Luther King days, reaching out, doing all of that. We one day said, we're going to lunch. You want to go to lunch with us? And he said, no, I'm poor. I'm probably poorer than y'all are, but I'm still white. And that kind of exemplified the attitude that existed and still exists among some folks, not only in South Carolina, but in America. The spooky thing for me is that back in those days when I was doing op-eds for the state, I used to wish that South Carolina was more like the rest of America. Now, the strange thing is America has become more like South Carolina.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned minimally adequate for education. Justice Finney, who was the first Black Chief Justice, was the Congress of Racial Equality's attorney. And so the Congress of Racial Equality was the group that taught all the kids up and down the East Coast how to be nonviolent in their protests, nonviolent direct action. And Justice Finney, when he looked at the Constitution, which just said X number of months of education, tried to wring out of that you would have a minimally adequate education and you could balance a checkbook. This is years ago. You could do these basic tasks. And then he was mocked for that because that seemed so inadequate. But he was trying to create that out of the language. And then this is through Abbeville v. South Carolina, which was more than 30 years ago, when 36 school districts said we are not adequately funded. And I have horrible examples of how inadequate that funding was. And so that lawsuit was appealed twice. The legislature didn't touch it. It didn't do what was initially asked of it, which was nothing but improving kindergarten. And finally, the more recent state Supreme Court said, well, even what Justice Finney says is extending past our powers. So nothing has happened. Nothing has happened to make even minimally adequate. So at that point in time, there were schools that still had, so this is in the 90s, textbooks and school books in their libraries saying, one day there'll be a man on the moon.
Yeah.
There were science teachers that were going out and looking for roadkill for their kids to have in biology lab to do experiments. There was a 1896 school that had a bell tower that fell on the principal's desk. Luckily, he wasn't sitting there because it was so full of bat guano, which is bat defecation. You may remember President Obama standing in front of a South Carolina school. It's called the Corridor of Shame still. So that tells you a lot about a state when they don't want to educate pretty much anybody, but most especially Black people. And so our counties are carved up that way. We have school districts where there's a school district in a county that's all white, and then a school district that's all Black with a white school board in some cases. And you can imagine how that works out for people.
Oh, it's amazing to see. One of the things that told me a lot about education in South Carolina, some years ago, I did an NAACP speech at the high school in Dillon, South Carolina. And the auditorium was just a wreck. I mean, it was ancient, it was horrible. And I was talking with the guy who invited me, and I said, it's a shame how they have neglected Black schools. And he said, oh, no. This is the originally white school. The Black school is much worse than this. And, this place was about to fall in on us. As a matter of fact, that's a school that President Obama visited and was invited to by a young student. And they've rebuilt it now since the president's been there. But that was still an active school just 20 years ago.
Yeah, you have to ask yourself, why the power structure would not want an educated populace.
Well, it's an
important question.
I think South Carolina has always educated the populace to the degree that you could get the workforce together. So when it was totally agrarian state, then minimally adequate meant a little bit of counting and a little bit of literacy, first, second grade, maybe through elementary school. And it became a manufacturing state, textile state, then maybe it ran through junior high school. But there's never been the emphasis on the educated group, because you got to have some folks who are pliable. And that's only starting to change now, because to do some basic jobs, you still need to have some basic knowledge of technology. And so some places are doing better now, but that's why some companies are located in South Carolina, because the wages are cheap and the natives are quick.
Yeah, Hollings was praised for pushing the tech schools, but just a few years before, during the civil rights sit-ins in the early 60s, he had said that he would not have biracial committees, which a lot of cities were setting up and desegregating their lunch counters, because it would ruin the good Black people. if they were in biracial committees. And then in the Charleston hospital strike in 1969, which I write about, Governor McNair sending down National Guard with loaded rifles with bayonets on them to oppose 400 Black women who are marching with their children on the streets. And he's completely opposed to them because of unions. And he's saying that that would ruin the workforce. Now there were unions because there were federal jobs like at the Charleston Naval Yard, but he pretty much locked down Charleston for several months and was losing, the state was losing hundreds of millions of dollars because of this anti-union stance, which, you know, is going on now in Alabama with Amazon. So going back to people, I admire Reverend Darby because he's a wonderful writer, he's a wonderful speaker, but he's a truth to power person. And we need those people so much. And, or, you know, you think about, you know, the little tale of the child who says the emperor has no clothes. That can make us pull back in horror, but we need to move forward and put our thinking caps on about this if we want to live in a place that's good for all our children. And that was very much the motivation, for example, with the Briggs versus Elliott petitioners. They all lost their jobs. They were all fired. As I pointed out in some of the pictures, they lost their houses that were burned down or their churches were burned down. But years later, Harry Briggs, who ended up in New York after hunting for jobs all over the country, deeply poor, and he was asked, would he do it again? And he said that it did nothing for my children, but I did it for all children. And I think that's what we need to keep in mind all the time, that if we do want the world to be a better place, we can't be doing it for ourselves. We have to be doing it for the future. And we have to keep the future in mind and not have that self-interest pushing us, having the greater good in mind, because movements do take time. They do take time.
Oh yeah, and it's something that especially the Clarendon folk exemplified, that you've got to do something to improve the next generation. And I think that's why for many, many, many Black families, there's an emphasis on education. I have two sons, they are doing quite well. And I'm thankful because, you know, the next generation ought to do better than the previous generation. And there's a feeling of that, there's a sense of that in the Black community. And it comes through in all of the stories of people that were told in your book. And it also comes through that to do that, you've got to speak truth to power sometimes. Appreciate all of the compliments, that's nice, but you've got to do that because people get uncomfortable with that. It's after the Emmanuel massacre, I ticked some folk off because I said, well, this is nice, you know, the forgiveness, but you know, when forgiveness happened biblically, you were supposed to repent and do better. So what's to do better? How do we do that differently? How do we have the difficult conversations that we need to have and do the difficult things to kind of really walk together and not get weary, as the old spiritual says?
Yes, you're required to be uncomfortable, aren't you?
Of course. Yes. I enjoy sometimes inflicting discomfort.
Well, I think it's sometimes, unfortunately, through discomfort that we are moved to ask for change. And that can be you can be in a comfortable position yourself, but you should be discomfortable, have discomfort and be uncomfortable if others are suffering. Because we all are humans who want love and comfort, and we all want to avoid suffering, and we should be helping each other avoid the suffering. I do think, you know, as a former education reporter, that getting people educated well so that they can make healthful decisions themselves and implement them is one of the most important things that a state can be doing to protect the well-being of its people.
Yeah. It's a little discomfort out of it. Surgery is no fun, but surgery fixes things that needs to be fixed physically. And there needs to be a little surgery on America still to get America to where America should be. And people of goodwill, people of vision, have to be able to work together, even if that sometimes makes people uncomfortable, even if it sometimes makes you uncomfortable yourself, because that's how progress comes to be.
Yeah, self-examination can be painful.
Yeah.
But useful, yeah, but useful.
Yeah.
And let me talk about inspiration here. People like Reverend Darby or Reverend Hinton, Frances Singleton, who spent nights in jail to make the point that it was not okay in Sumter to be treated the way she was treated. June Manning Thomas, who got locked up at the mass march in a jail cell with a murderer, who said, "Honey, I'm going to take care of you. Don't you be afraid." These are people who stepped out, and it mattered that they stepped out, and they are inspiring. And so sometimes if you feel like you're faltering, there's so many places to look for inspiring people to ensure that you can keep going on too.
Exactly.
Well, I think, Jonathan, we're almost out of time, aren't we?
We are, but it has been an hour so well spent. So let me do that. Oops, there I am. Y'all have been incredible. Thank you for this. You were answering a lot of questions coming into the chat. People want to know, and this is a very common reaction at our March 4th events. This is in part why we have them, to educate people, and they have that education. It sort of changes their sensibility, and they want to know what can they do next? How can they be better? How can they march forth in the spirit of this event? And you've given them some wonderful insights into potential next steps they can take in their lives and in their communities. And I so appreciate your time this morning doing that.
Glad to.
Mentor a child. That would be my bottom line. Every school needs someone, it might be virtual right now, to read a story in the morning, help somebody with their homework. And that is a very powerful act that can add to your life for years if you pick a young child to mentor. So I would recommend that. What would be your one specific step, Reverend?
My one specific step would be to see who's registering voters in your community. Register as many people with good sense and decency as you can find, mobilize them, educate them, so that we can elect people with good sense and decency to public office who are interested in effecting policy and not just being elected to hold on to a seat.
Good advice from both of you. Thank you both for that. Thank you to our audience here in the Zoom room, and thank you to everybody who will eventually watch the recorded version of this on our YouTube channel and elsewhere. Claudia, Reverend Darby, again, thank you so much for joining us for March 4th. We, the Conroy Center, will be back online at 11:30 with Bakari Sellers in conversation with Adam Parker, and we'll see y'all then.
Okay. Goodbye, Reverend Darby. Goodbye, Jonathan.
Bye-bye. Y'all take care.
Thank you very much. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you for being here.